Nancy Pelosi just committed the singular miscalculation that no prominent Democrat has survived in 3 decades. She made the conscious, arrogant decision to aggressively lecture Senator John Kennedy about political ethics on live television. She chose to mount this perilous high horse while her husband Paul was comfortably sitting on a $250 million fortune, a massive financial empire built on highly suspicious market trades that miraculously landed mere weeks before every major piece of legislation she unilaterally controlled. She had forgotten one exceptionally critical detail about the man sitting across the dais. John Kennedy is not just a folksy character for the cameras, he holds a rigorous degree from Oxford University. He served as a brilliant editor for the prestigious Virginia Law Review, and he meticulously practiced law for 30 years in the cutthroat courtrooms of Louisiana before ever stepping onto the Senate floor. Kennedy operates by the unbreakable rule of ruthless cross-examination. He has never, not once in his storied career, asked a question to which he did not already possess the devastating answer. The scene was perfectly set inside room 538 of the Dirksen Senate Office Building, where the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs had convened at exactly 10:00 a.m. for a hearing officially titled Congressional Ethics, Financial Transparency, and the Stock Act. It was an agonizingly dry procedural title that practically guaranteed absolutely nobody would tune in, unless something genuinely extraordinary was about to unfold. And something extraordinary was already in motion. The high-stakes hearing had been aggressively catalyzed by Senator Rick Scott's formal request for a Government Accountability Office audit into Pelosi's impeccably timed trading history. For years, infuriated retail investors had spent countless hours relentlessly tracking her husband's inexplicably lucrative trades through decentralized apps and massive social media accounts boasting millions of cynical followers. The notorious Pelosi tracker had evolved into a pervasive cultural phenomenon, a running bitter joke that doubled as a searing public indictment of a profoundly broken system. The very woman who had vehemently opposed banning congressional stock trading was now sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights as the undeniable face of everything systematically wrong with the practice. Nancy Pelosi had not been subpoenaed. She had been politely invited to testify, and she accepted with the unshakable arrogance of a political titan who, in 40 years of blood sport Washington politics, had never once backed down from a fight. She had miraculously survived grueling ethics complaints, unprecedented impeachment battles, catastrophic government shutdowns, and a global pandemic. A routine committee hearing featuring a notoriously drawling senator from Louisiana was, in her seasoned estimation, just another manageable Tuesday. She sat at the heavy oak witness table with a meticulously prepared statement, flanked by 2 hyper-vigilant staffers, radiating the quiet, lethal confidence of a woman who had been foolishly underestimated before and had subsequently made every single one of her detractors pay an agonizing price. Up on the elevated dais, Senator John Kennedy assumed his usual disarming posture, sitting slightly slouched with his reading glasses perched precariously low on his nose. To his left lay a standard yellow legal pad, but to his right sat a massive, intimidatingly thick binder, meticulously tabbed and color-coded with the exact precision of a man who had once made his living systematically destroying hostile witnesses. He adjusted his microphone with deliberate slowness, took a measured sip from his ceramic coffee mug, and offered the room a small, exceedingly polite Southern gentleman's smile that almost always precedes the serving of something absolutely not sweet. The first hour of the proceedings passed with unremarkable predictability, as various other senators asked expected, heavily scripted questions regarding the Stock Act's notoriously porous disclosure requirements and laughable penalties. Pelosi effortlessly batted away the inquiries, answering with a polished fluency that demonstrated exactly why she had ruled her caucus with an iron fist for decades. She pointedly reminded the captive committee that she absolutely did not personally own or actively trade individual stocks, aggressively pushing the narrative that her husband, a professional venture capitalist, managed the family's sprawling investments with total independence. Then, the chairman struck his gavel and recognized the senator from Louisiana, unknowingly initiating what would soon be universally recognized as the most devastating, surgically precise takedown of congressional insider trading in the history of the United States Senate. Kennedy spoke with an agonizing, deliberate slowness, letting the thick silence of the cavernous room amplify the deep cadence of his voice. Speaker Pelosi, thank you for being here today. I genuinely appreciate your willingness to sit down and answer some questions about a subject that the hardworking American people care about quite a bit. Pelosi simply nodded, her posture perfectly relaxed, completely unaware of the trap that had just been quietly sprung. Before I get into any specific numbers or dates, Kennedy continued, his tone conversational and mild, I want to ask you a very foundational question. Do you fundamentally believe that elected members of Congress or their immediate spouses should be legally allowed to trade individual stocks in the open market while that specific member has active, unrestricted access to non-public, highly sensitive legislative information? Pelosi instantly leaned into her microphone, her chin lifting slightly in the unmistakable, rehearsed posture of a seasoned politician about to proudly deliver a prepackaged line she had successfully delivered 100 times before. Senator Kennedy, I have always firmly and unequivocally believed that we live in a robust free market economy and that members of Congress, along with their families, should be fully able to participate in that free market economy, just like anyone else. The Stock Act clearly requires strict financial disclosure, and I have always, without fail, complied fully with every single disclosure requirement mandated by law. Up on the dais, Kennedy simply nodded, betraying absolutely no emotion, as he picked up his pen and slowly wrote something down on his yellow legal pad. That exact moment was precisely where Pelosi should have stopped talking, but her deeply ingrained pride simply wouldn't allow it. Frankly, Senator, she continued, her voice suddenly sharpening as the polite tone instantly evaporated, replaced by something undeniably hostile. I find it intensely ironic that Republicans are now aggressively demanding that dedicated public servants be strictly prohibited from participating in the very same economy they tirelessly work to legislate and protect. This hearing, sir, is absolutely not about governmental transparency. It is about cheap political theater. It is entirely about generating sensationalized viral clips for social media instead of actually passing meaningful legislation that helps the struggling American people. She locked eyes directly with Kennedy, radiating furious indignance. I do not need to be lectured about ethics by a man whose absolute primary legislative contribution consists mostly of folksy anecdotes and clever sound bites for cable news. I have successfully shepherded the Affordable Care Act. I steadfastly led this country through the darkest days of a global pandemic. I have honorably served my constituents for 40 years. And I will absolutely not sit here today while my entire life's profound work is cheaply reduced to a trivial internet meme about stock trading. A low, electric murmur immediately rolled through the packed public gallery. Senator Elizabeth Warren offered a brief nod of progressive solidarity, while a frantic political reporter instantly began drafting a headline about Pelosi schooling Kennedy. Through it all, Kennedy did not react, frown, or interrupt. He simply sat perfectly still, his pen resting lightly on his legal pad, watching Pelosi with the cold patience of a veteran trial lawyer who has just watched a hostile witness voluntarily surrender a goldmine of devastating information nobody had even asked her to provide. When she finally finished her defiant monologue, the resulting silence in room 538 stretched for 4 agonizingly tense seconds. Kennedy deliberately took a slow sip of ice water, carefully set the glass down, and looked at his yellow pad. Speaker Pelosi, thank you for your candor. I appreciate it. I really, truly do, he began, his thick Louisiana drawl unhurried and warm. And you know you're entirely right about one thing. I absolutely do tell folksy stories because where I come from down in Louisiana, we firmly believe that a good, honest story can teach a man a whole lot more than a good, self-righteous lecture. He paused, letting the subtle jab hang in the air. But back home, we also have a very old saying. We say that when somebody's house is made entirely out of incredibly fragile glass, they really ought not stand in the front yard and throw big heavy rocks at the courthouse. You just threw a whole lot of heavy rocks in this room, Speaker, so let's just take a quiet little moment and see exactly what happens to the glass. With a deliberate motion that drew the eye of every camera in the room, Kennedy reached out and opened his massive color-coded binder. Let's start our little story with a company called Visa, specifically in March of 2008, he said, his voice dropping slightly. Down at the witness table, the pen in Pelosi's hand instantly stopped moving. In March 2008, your husband miraculously managed to purchase exactly 5,000 shares of Visa at the highly coveted initial public offering price of exactly $44 per share. Now, for the folks watching at home, an IPO opening price is almost universally reserved exclusively for massive institutional investors and towering Wall Street banks. It is extraordinarily unusual for a single private individual to receive a massive, lucrative IPO allocation of a major global company unless that individual happens to have some very, very good friends in very, very high places. Kennedy's fingers elegantly flipped to the next tabbed page. Now, precisely 2 days after your husband secured those shares at that special $44 price, Visa's stock price immediately rocketed up to $64 a share on the open market. That, ma'am, is a staggering 50% return on investment in exactly 48 hours. That is a very, very good 2 days for the Pelosi household. He picked up his pen and wrote the numbers on his legal pad, intentionally writing large enough for the high-definition C-SPAN cameras to easily zoom in and read $44. $64. 2 days. Now, here's the specific parts of this story that deeply concerns me, Kennedy continued, leaning forward. At the exact same time your husband was quietly receiving this massive allocation, you, sitting as the immensely powerful Speaker of the House, had a very specific piece of legislation sitting right on your desk. It was called the Credit Card Fair Fee Act. This bill would have legally required massive credit card companies, entirely including Visa, to fairly negotiate their lucrative swipe fees directly with desperate merchants. Naturally, Visa aggressively opposed this legislation because passing it would have ultimately cost their executives billions. That bill's speaker miraculously never made it to the House floor for a single vote. You, as the Speaker of the House, the sole authority who decides which bills get voted on, never brought it forward. And I've looked very closely at the official lobbying records. Visa's highly paid lobbyists visited your personal congressional office exactly 3 times in the single month, directly preceding that wildly lucrative IPO allocation. Up in the gallery, a veteran camera operator quickly adjusted his angle to capture Pelosi's tightening jawline. So, let me make entirely sure I clearly understand this miraculous timeline, Kennedy summarized, his voice cutting like a scalpel. Visa desperately lobbies your office to kill a bill. Your husband miraculously gets a sweetheart ground floor deal on Visa's highly exclusive IPO. He instantly makes a massive 50% return in just 2 days, and the very legislation that would have severely hurt Visa's bottom line quietly dies without ever getting a vote. Kennedy forcefully closed the tab in his binder. Speaker, where I come from. When a man's wife purposefully buys stock in the exact same corporate entity whose regulatory bill her incredibly powerful husband is simultaneously killing in the state legislature, we absolutely do not call that a happy coincidence. We call that just another Tuesday at the Pelosi household. Pelosi's eyes flashed with a cold, calculated fury. Senator, this tired conspiracy theory has been thoroughly and repeatedly debunked, she fired back, her voice tightly controlled. My husband made his independent investment entirely through his long-standing broker at Wells Fargo, strictly upon that licensed broker's professional recommendation. Kennedy didn't blink. I'm very sure he did, ma'am, he replied gently. But you see, I wasn't asking you a single thing about the broker at Wells Fargo. I was asking you directly about the specific legislation, the vital bill that quietly died right there on your majestic desk, while your husband happily held the stock. That's a completely different question, Speaker, and you deliberately didn't answer it. Without waiting for her to formulate another deflection, Kennedy immediately flipped to the next brightly colored tab. But Visa was just one single trade, one incredibly lucky coincidence. So let's zoom out and talk about the undeniable, staggering pattern. Directly behind Pelosi, a young staffer holding an illuminated tablet had completely stopped typing. June 2022, Kennedy announced with forensic clarity. Your husband astutely exercised extremely complex call options to purchase exactly 20,000 shares of Nvidia, a massive global semiconductor company, at approximately $100 per share. The total staggering value of this single transaction was somewhere between $1 million and $5 million, exactly according to your own legally mandated financial disclosure forms. Kennedy deliberately paused, letting those massive numbers settle. Exactly 3 short weeks later, the United States Senate was officially scheduled to hold a highly anticipated vote on the CHIPS and Science Act, a gargantuan $280 billion legislative package explicitly designed to heavily subsidize domestic semiconductor manufacturing. You, Speaker Pelosi, had loudly and publicly supported the CHIPS Act. You had fiercely championed it in the press. He looked directly over his glasses. Your husband aggressively bought millions of dollars in highly volatile semiconductor stocks exactly 3 weeks before a historic vote on a bill that would eventually send $280 billion taxpayer dollars directly into the very semiconductor industry his newly acquired shares entirely depended upon for their staggering growth. Before Pelosi could object, Kennedy smoothly slid out a large, professionally printed timeline, dense with bold dates and massive financial transactions. I explicitly instructed my investigative staff to meticulously compile every single major Paul Pelosi stock trade over the past 15 years and place them directly alongside your personal legislative calendar. Everyone in this room needs to see this. He held the thick card up to the network cameras. 2008. The Visa IPO hits exactly while legislation heavily affecting credit card companies is mysteriously stalled on your desk. 2020. Your husband astutely purchases massive leveraged call options in Apple and Amazon mere weeks before major tech regulation hearings mysteriously conclude without any meaningful action. 2021. Massive call options in Google's parent company, Alphabet, are secured while sweeping antitrust hearings go absolutely nowhere. 2022. The Nvidia trades right before the monumental CHIPS Act. 2024. Heavily leveraged AI-related stocks are aggressively purchased just weeks before highly classified regulatory framework discussions take place in your committees. Kennedy slowly lowered the heavy card. Any one of these incredible events could theoretically be a lucky coincidence. Two of them might still be a coincidence. But Speaker Pelosi, there are brilliant retail investors who have actually built sophisticated apps specifically to track your husband's daily trades because his stock trades magically correlate with your highly restricted legislative activity at a staggering, unbelievable rate that would literally make a professional statistician's head spin right off their shoulders. He forcefully tapped his pen against the pad. I commissioned a completely independent, rigorous financial analysis. The undeniable data shows that your husband's incredibly timed portfolio averaged a staggering 28% annual return over a 15-year period. The absolute top 1% of the most brilliant hedge fund managers on Wall Street average 18 to 22% on their absolute best days. So we are expected to believe that your husband somehow magically outperformed the absolute best institutional investors on Wall Street, consistently, year after year, all while happily married to the exact woman who single-handedly decides which market-moving bills become the law of the land. Pelosi's voice was undeniably tight, with suppressed rage. My husband is an incredibly sophisticated, highly educated investor, Senator. His vast, complex investments are entirely, fundamentally independent of my dedicated legislative work. Kennedy's eyes narrowed slightly. Ma'am, I absolutely didn't say he wasn't a sophisticated man. I'm just merely pointing out the mathematical miracle that his extreme sophistication just happens to completely peak every single time your closely held legislative calendar gets incredibly busy. That is a truly remarkable, almost supernatural financial gift. He reached for his water glass. Now let's put away the individual trades and talk about the bottom line. Kennedy calmly closed the massive binder, picking up his yellow legal pad. He uncapped his pen and began writing slowly, making sure every single scratch of the ink was picked up by the microphones. 1987, you entered Congress, $3 million, $174,000 annual salary, 2025, estimated net worth, $250 million. He set the pen down. Speaker Pelosi, you first entered Congress in 1987 with an estimated net worth of approximately $3 million. Your official congressional salary has strictly been $174,000 per year. Today, your rigorously estimated household net worth is a staggering $250 million. 38 incredible years of public service multiplied by $174,000 equals approximately $6.5 million in total gross income before taxes. Even if you lived entirely for free, never paid a single dime in taxes, never bought groceries, never paid tuition, you would mathematically have exactly $6.5 million sitting in the bank today. Not $250 million. Kennedy leaned back slightly in his large leather chair. Now, you'll furiously argue that the vast majority of this staggering wealth was generated strictly through your husband's brilliant investments. I entirely accept that basic premise. But Speaker, here is the absolute truth that I just cannot logically accept. His heavily scrutinized firm, Financial Leasing Services, didn't actually become spectacularly profitable until directly after you became the incredibly powerful Speaker of the House. His absolute best financial years miraculously correlate perfectly with your absolute most powerful political years. and his absolute worst years mysteriously correlate directly with the exact years you were unfortunately out of the Democratic leadership. That, ma'am, is absolutely not a lucky coincidence. That is a highly refined, fiercely protected business model. He wrote one final line on the pad, 3 million to 250 million. That is an astonishing 233% massive growth, while surviving on a modest 174K government salary. A prominent real estate investor named Grant Cardone looked at your staggering numbers and clearly said, she would mathematically have to be 33,000 years old to legitimately accumulate that kind of massive wealth on a standard congressional salary. That's a highly successful man who makes his entire living completely understanding how money works, and even he absolutely cannot mathematically explain yours. Pelosi's face had gone completely terrifyingly still. Senator, his investments are entirely, fundamentally independent of my dedicated legislative work. Kennedy interrupted her with devastating precision. They are literally listed directly on your own mandatory financial disclosure form, Speaker. Forms personally signed by you under the strict penalty of federal perjury. You absolutely cannot legally claim they are entirely independent to the press, and then simultaneously report them as joint household assets on a sworn federal document to avoid scrutiny. It is one or the other, Speaker. It is absolutely not both. Having systematically dismantled her financial defenses, Kennedy calmly closed the yellow legal pad and fundamentally altered the entire mood of the interrogation, his tone shifting into a mournful Sunday preacher delivering a deeply tragic eulogy. Speaker Pelosi, I want to completely change the subject for just a moment. I want to talk to you about the beautiful city of San Francisco. You have proudly represented the incredible people of San Francisco for 40 long years. You first entered Congress in 1987, back when that magnificent city was widely celebrated as the absolute shining jewel of the American West Coast. Let me just take a moment to tell you exactly what your beautiful San Francisco looks like today. He spoke purely from memory, his voice carrying the heavy weight of a devastating tragedy. Right now, there are over 8,000 desperate human beings sleeping on the cold concrete. Massive open-air drug markets operate in broad daylight in the Tenderloin district. Fentanyl overdose deaths have reached such horrific record levels that the morgues literally cannot keep up. Generational family-owned businesses are frantically fleeing because they physically cannot keep their doors open. Brazen retail theft has become so entirely normalized that local pharmacies are literally chaining their basic merchandise to the store shelves. There is actual untreated human waste smeared on the sidewalks where children walk to school. International tourists are now actively telling their friends and families, whatever you do, don't go there. His voice dropped to a near whisper. While your personal net worth miraculously exploded from $3 million to $250 million, your own district's horrific homeless population utterly tripled. While your husband was aggressively buying up leveraged Nvidia call options, desperate small business owners were frantically boarding up their shattered storefront windows. While you were forcefully fighting on national television against a bipartisan congressional stock trading ban and arrogantly telling reporters that millionaire legislators should be allowed to participate in the free market, terrified families in your district were literally stepping over bloody needles just to safely get their young children to elementary school. Kennedy looked directly down at Pelosi with profound pity. You personally own a massive, breathtakingly beautiful vineyard up in Napa Valley, valued between $5 and $25 million. It produces an exquisite wine that easily sells for hundreds of dollars a single bottle. And exactly 37 miles away, directly in the heart of the very district you swore an oath to represent, American citizens are literally dying on the dirty sidewalk. He extracted a single handwritten letter from his binder. This deeply heartbreaking letter is from a hardworking woman named Margaret Chen. She proudly owned a beautiful little flower shop on Clement Street for exactly 22 years. She closed her doors in 2023. She actually took the time to write to your prestigious congressional office exactly 17 times, practically begging for help with the explosive crime completely suffocating her little store. She received exactly 0 responses from you or your massive staff. Kennedy read the letter with agonizing reverence. Her final letter simply said this: I dutifully voted for you in every single election for 20 straight years. You just got richer and I just got robbed. Nobody in your massive office ever even bothered to call me back. He gently set the letter down. Speaker, with all due and profound respect, your suffering constituents literally cannot afford to buy the expensive wine from your beautiful Napa vineyard. Pelosi angrily opened her mouth to mount a defense, but Kennedy was already forcefully turning the page. Now, I want to completely shift gears and talk to you about the concept of rules. You have extremely strong opinions about how strict rules must apply to the American people. Kennedy's pace dramatically quickened into a relentless barrage. September 2020, you forcefully mandated strict mask-wearing protocols on the entire floor of the House of Representatives, calling it an absolute matter of life and death, and then you casually walked right into a salon in San Francisco, completely without a mask on your face, forcefully demanding a private blowout, while every single other salon in the entire city was legally forced to remain completely shut down. When you were rightfully caught on the struggling salon's own security cameras, you arrogantly called it a malicious setup. The terrified salon owner Erica Cuse completely lost her entire business due to the massive backlash from your loyal supporters. Kennedy didn't pause for a fraction of a second. May 28, 2022, your husband, Paul Pelosi, violently crashed his incredibly expensive Porsche directly into an innocent man's Jeep in Napa County while highly intoxicated. He magically got a lenient sentence of just 5 days, actually served 2, and didn't even have to bother attending his own mandated sentencing hearing. Most ordinary folks out there who violently crash a luxury Porsche into another innocent citizen's car while heavily intoxicated absolutely do not get just 5 days in a comfortable cell. And they certainly do not get the incredible luxury of just completely skipping their own sentencing hearing. And then there is the massive reality of the family business. Your son linked to federal scrutiny, your nephew, governor of California, your husband's massive financial firm operating heavily in California. Ma'am, that is absolutely not a career in public service. That is a massive, untouchable royal franchise where the crushing rules strictly apply to every single ordinary citizen, except the exact family that gets to write them. Pelosi finally snapped, violently turning her furious gaze toward the chairman. Mr. Chairman, this hearing has completely and utterly devolved into a vicious, entirely baseless personal attack against me and my innocent family. But Kennedy's deep voice rolled right over her outrage. Speaker, you just spent 3 full minutes aggressively attacking my personal character on national television. You loudly declared that the most incredibly powerful woman in the history of Congress absolutely didn't need to be lectured by a simple man like me. All I have done, ma'am, for the last 25 minutes is quietly and politely respond to your insults with hard government documents and your own public actions. As we like to say down in Louisiana, fair is fair. With profound theatrical finality, Kennedy completely closed the massive binder, carefully took off his reading glasses, and spoke completely without referencing any notes. Speaker Pelosi, I want to close this phase of the hearing today by simply using your own exact words. In December of 2021, you proudly said, "We are a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that." 6 devastating words, Speaker. And in those exact 6 words, you proudly and arrogantly told the entire American public exactly what you fundamentally believe. You genuinely believe that the incredibly powerful elites who single-handedly write the rules should absolutely be legally allowed to massively profit from the very rules they write. You genuinely believe that the term free market simply means free for you, free to ruthlessly trade on highly classified, non-public information that regular Americans will never have access to, free to miraculously accumulate massive dynastic wealth that regular tax-paying Americans mathematically cannot even begin to explain. So let me tell everyone exactly what the overwhelming evidence actually shows today. It undeniably shows a staggering pattern of incredibly lucrative trades perfectly correlating with your closely guarded legislative calendar at a rate that absolutely no honest, mathematically sound explanation can possibly cover. It tragically shows that your own district got poorer, sicker, and more incredibly dangerous while you rapidly got richer. It shows that you forcefully mandated strict masks for the entire American public, but arrogantly decided those rules didn't apply to yourself. And above all else, it shows that whenever any brave citizen dares to ask you to honestly explain any of this staggering hypocrisy, your arrogant answer is always exactly the same. It's a free market economy. He paused, letting the suffocating silence hang in the air. Back home in Louisiana, we have a very old story about a clever fox who was hired to closely guard the town's hen house. Every single morning, the farmer would count his precious chickens. And every single morning, mysteriously, there were fewer and fewer chickens. But the clever fox always had a perfectly reasonable, highly sophisticated explanation ready to go. and the desperate farmer deeply wanted to believe the fox because the fox was incredibly smart and had been proudly guarding that exact same henhouse for 40 long years. But then one day, the exhausted farmer finally stopped uselessly counting the missing chickens, and he decided to start counting the massive pile of eggs sitting right there in the fox's den. Another suffocating pause stretched across the room. Speaker Pelosi, the exhausted American people have finally stopped counting the chickens. We have started carefully counting the eggs, and unfortunately for you, ma'am, your den is very, very full. Absolute. Total silence blanketed room 538. Kennedy calmly gathered his scattered papers. I have absolutely no further questions for this witness, Mr. Chairman. The entire hearing room physically held its breath as the cameras stayed fiercely fixed on Pelosi's face. She sat completely motionless for exactly 5 agonizingly long seconds. Her panicked chief of staff frantically leaned forward and desperately whispered something urgent directly into her ear. Mr. Chairman, Pelosi finally managed to say, her voice completely stripped of its booming authority. I formally request a brief, immediate recess. I need to urgently consult with my legal counsel. The chairman slowly nodded, and Pelosi hastily rose from the witness table, her panicked staff rushing her toward the secure corridor. 10 tense minutes slowly became 30. 30 agonizing minutes eventually stretched into a full hour. Finally, her visibly shaken chief of staff returned. The chairman struck his gavel. Speaker Pelosi will absolutely not be returning to the hearing today. She has unfortunately been unexpectedly taken ill. Kennedy was already standing casually at the main exit when the desperate press scrum surrounded him. Senator Kennedy, do you have any official comment regarding Speaker Pelosi suddenly leaving the hearing? Kennedy looked directly at the frantic reporters with an incredibly polite expression. Well, folks, back home in Louisiana, we say you can really tell an awful lot about a person's true character by whether they bravely stay in the room when all the heavy receipts finally come out. Some people respectfully stay and honestly answer the hard questions. And some people just get miraculously, unexpectedly ill. You all have a really good, safe afternoon now. The explosive clip of Nancy Pelosi frantically requesting an emergency recess and inexplicably never returning went massively viral across every single digital platform. The immediate catastrophic aftermath morphed into a full-blown political apocalypse. Within a staggering 72 hours, the Securities and Exchange Commission officially announced a massive formal investigation into the highly suspicious trading patterns executed by sitting members of Congress. Sweeping federal subpoenas were instantly issued directly to Paul Pelosi's terrified broker. By the start of the second chaotic week, the formidable Department of Justice had officially opened a massive parallel criminal investigation into wire fraud, massive securities fraud, and a sweeping criminal conspiracy to commit egregious insider trading. Federal prosecutors relentlessly subpoenaed Pelosi's restricted calendars, encrypted phone logs, and secure private emails. The political collapse was astonishingly swift and absolutely merciless. Former fierce allies in the powerful Progressive Caucus were suddenly, conspicuously silent. Even Gavin Newsom nervously issued a highly sanitized statement strategically defending absolutely no one by name. The massive Pelosi tracker apps suddenly went completely dark because the trading accounts had been completely federally frozen by an emergency court order. Exactly 6 agonizing weeks after the devastating Senate hearing, grim-faced FBI agents raided the luxurious San Francisco offices of financial leasing services. Paul Pelosi's former broker at Wells Fargo immediately flipped and fully cooperated with ruthless federal prosecutors. Exactly 4 months after Kennedy's surgical takedown, a federal grand jury officially returned a staggering 47-count criminal indictment. Nancy Pelosi and Paul Pelosi were aggressively charged with massive securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit insider trading, tax fraud, obstruction of justice, and extreme Stock Act violations. Bail was harshly set at $10 million. The relentless prosecution methodically presented the exact same damning pattern Senator Kennedy had brilliantly outlined. 47 massive, incredibly lucrative trades spanning across 15 years, expertly timed within weeks of major legislative action. The true fatal blow came when a deeply trusted senior Pelosi staffer tearfully testified under oath that the speaker routinely discussed highly classified, market-moving legislative timing on personal, unsecured phone calls directly with her husband. The jury was completely unpersuaded by the defense. The devastating verdict echoed like a gunshot, guilty on 38 of the 47 counts. The federal judge delivered a scathing sentencing statement. Mrs. Pelosi, You repeatedly used your sacred trust as a massive, illegal trading advantage. You ruthlessly accumulated a staggering fortune that absolutely no honest public servant could ever hope to logically explain. Nancy Pelosi was sentenced to 7 solid years in federal prison alongside $42 million in mandatory restitution. Paul Pelosi received 5 years in federal prison. Congress, terrified of the massive public backlash, frantically passed the most comprehensive, ironclad stock trading ban in history. The victorious conservatives gleefully dubbed it the Pelosi Act. Kennedy's incredible approval rating in Louisiana massively skyrocketed to an unprecedented 74%. Far across the country in a deeply altered San Francisco, the reverberations of this political earthquake finally reached a small, cramped apartment overlooking Clement Street, where Margaret Chen quietly watched the historic sentencing broadcast live on a glowing television screen. She was no longer the proud owner of a bustling neighborhood flower shop, having been tragically reduced to quietly scanning groceries part-time at a sterile corporate supermarket, but as she sat beside her grown daughter and watched an 84-year-old Nancy Pelosi stand frail and utterly defeated before a stern federal judge, Margaret offered no loud cheers of vindication or petty gloating. Instead, she simply offered the slow, heavy nod of a woman experiencing profound, long-awaited closure, quietly whispering that after 40 years of dutifully casting her ballot for that very woman, it ultimately took a complete stranger, a folksy, drawling man from the distant swamps of Louisiana to actually care about the survival of her little flower shop. Turning off the television and gazing out her smudged window at the exact street corner where her life's work used to proudly stand, Margaret let a wave of bittersweet peace wash over her tired soul, quietly thankful that someone finally possessed the sheer, unyielding courage to ask the damn question, and even more thankful that the most powerful woman in Washington was finally forced to answer it. If you have made it this far into this incredible saga, you have just actively witnessed the devastating, undeniable reality of what inevitably happens when cold, hard receipts violently collide with cheap, arrogant political rhetoric, and the receipts decisively win the day. You need to smash that like button right now if you truly believe that Senator Kennedy definitively proved to the entire world that absolutely nobody, no matter their vast wealth or untouchable title, is ever above the law, and be sure to heavily subscribe to the channel for more incredible, historic deep dives where meticulous, ruthless preparation utterly destroys arrogant performance on the national stage. Share this crucial, eye-opening video with absolutely everyone who has ever angrily wondered exactly how a supposedly dedicated public servant magically transforms into a quarter-billionaire while strictly living on your hard-earned tax dollars, and drop a comment below right now to tell us your absolute favorite, most devastating moment from this legendary congressional takedown. Make sure to turn on your bell notifications immediately, because while the historic Pelosi Act is now permanently enshrined as the law of the land, and while an unassuming 73-year-old senator is currently sitting quietly on his Louisiana porch, peacefully sipping his black coffee and patiently waiting for the absolute next arrogant politician who foolishly thinks they can survive an Oxford-educated country lawyer armed with nothing but a yellow legal pad and a dangerously long memory, this explosive story is far from over. She proudly came to the Senate floor to deliver a condescending lecture, but he came heavily armed with the undeniable receipts, ensuring that only one of them bravely stayed in the room when the intense heat turned up, and only one of them managed to stay out of a federal prison cell. Yet, even as the ink barely dries on this monumental legislation and the exhausted nation finally takes a collective, desperate breath, the true political earthquake is only just beginning to violently rumble beneath our feet. Because right at this very second, deep inside a windowless, highly secured DOJ office in the heart of Washington, a relentless team of federal prosecutors is intensely staring at a newly uncovered, heavily encrypted hard drive, quietly and methodically drafting a massive, unprecedented subpoena targeting a name so utterly shocking, so deeply entrenched in the absolute highest echelons of American power, that absolutely no one in the Capitol ever expected to see it typed onto a federal warrant, leaving the entire terrified legislative branch desperately holding its breath in the dark, nervously waiting for the devastating, inevitable echo of the absolute next midnight knock on the door.